Hi all. So we'll make a not a long video, definitely longer than a short, but a quick video about the decline of Japan. I call it the decline of Japan or probably the death of Japan. Um, Contrary to what a lot of other people are saying, I believe Japan as a nation has a very high chance of ceasing to exist by the year 2035. And I'll talk about six to seven big reasons as to why I think this would happen. Not that I'm happy about it, but I think that is something which will definitely happen due to various things which are happening right now. So, what I'll do is I will try to quickly talk about the past of Japan, especially after World War II, and its decline since the 1990s, and then post 1990 as to what's happening right now. So, the first thing I want to talk about is the fertility rate of Japan. Japan has close to 1.3 as the fertility rate. A nation needs a fertility rate of close to 2.1 to sustain itself. We are in the year 2023 as we speak right now, and Japan has been below the sustenance rate of 2.1 basically uh, from close to the year 1992, if I'm not wrong, right? So basically, somewhere around 1989, 1990 was the time when Japan had signed the Plaza Accords, the famous Plaza Accords. I'll have another video on that, which wherein basically US kind of made sure that it destroyed the Japanese economy. So the fact that the problem is that since Japan has close to 28% of its population more than the age of 65, and as we already know that basically population from the age of 0 to 15 and population which is above basically 60 itself is kind of dependent population, which basically means that this population is not in its productive years. It is not producing per se a lot for the economy, and it is dependent on either pension benefits, social security schemes, or certain other schemes by the government itself to sustain itself. So Japan, unfortunately, right now has a very high dependent population, and that is not very good. Knowing that the fact that Japan itself, since the last 35 odd years, has basically had a very low fertility rate, which means the older population is living longer and it's growing old and it's becoming a huge chunk, whereas the younger population it's not there because people are not being born. So more tax pressure or more dependency pressure is coming to the younger generation. So the dependency ratio of Japan is below 4 right now as we speak. That means for every 4 people working, there is actually one person who's at least dependent on the system. And in fact, since Japan is a society which is aging very fast, it will very soon fall below 3 actually in the next decade itself. And that will be very difficult for Japan to sustain such a high amount of services. The second problem that I see with Japan is the national debt. Japan has basically 230% of its GDP as the national debt itself. That means if the Japanese economy is at, let's say, $5 trillion, multiply that 230%, that is the amount of national debt they have. If I have to put in a very small way. Now, some people say, hey, you know what? It's government debt. So basically, it's the government which owes. It's not per se as difficult as private debt itself. But the problem is that when a government owes a lot of debt to its own population because of kind of printing a lot of money and then having making sure that they're able to service as in provide the various services, what happens is then these governments tend to have very low interest rates, because when you have low interest rate, the government is able to take in a lot of debt and then keep on servicing that, keep on giving interest on that debt, and it's able to kind of inflate its balance sheet a lot. Now the problem that happens is that when a country goes through this cycle, right, and this bubble, like every bubble, has to eventually burst. The problem happens over there. The problem that happens is that Japan is basically an export based economy. The world is kind of now going through a slowdown. So basically, Japanese exports are not growing. The debt is growing a lot. And then Japan has two choices. If it lets the bubble explode, the yen will be demolished completely. So then the Japanese government will have to actually kind of go ahead and strengthen its yen. And to do that, it will have to kind of sell its dollar, right? So Japan holds close to more than $1 trillion right now in holdings itself, and that is going to be a very huge problem. Basically, Japan, in a way, it's kind of a protectorate of the United States, right? They have close to 130 odd American military bases over there. So this is going to be definitely very difficult for Japan. So the a declining population, wherein not a lot of children are being born, and therefore those children cannot go to the workforce, so they cannot exactly give a lot of taxes. And then to kind of cover up for that taxes, the government starts to print a lot of money, it takes in a lot of debt, and then to make sure that it is able to service that debt, it's kind of reduces the interest rate a lot. So this is more like a cycle. Both of these are kind of related, and when the first bubble will burst, it will have the impact on the second one. The second one will burst, it will have impact on the third one itself. The third biggest problem is, so during the 80s, Japan had a lot of these big companies, Sony, Toshiba. You had other electronic giants as well, like Panasonic, so on and so forth. But during 90s, when you had Google, Microsoft, Yahoo, all these IT companies which are coming up, Japan, unfortunately, at that point of time, was going through its basically depression. So the Japanese markets per se didn't have any money to invest in the next generation technology. You must have heard of companies like OpenAI. That's not a Japanese company. You must have heard about products like ChatGPT, Firefly, Google Bard. All these companies are not from Japan, even though they had great technology companies till 80s. What happened? Like, they had decades of this so-called lost decades in the 90s itself, or the childless generation which started in the 90s itself. So Japan started to go in a very long-term decline during this phase itself. The closest that you could possibly think of is something like this is when the horseback people from steppes started to raid tribes in northern Persia, and basically the Khazars started to raid, south over there itself. This is exactly what they did. They had a higher technology. They knew that the empires below were kind of not doing well. So they started to attack, and they started to destroy them. Similarly, let's say Japan as a society is dying, it's declining, and all of a sudden China decides to attack, let's say, Taiwan, or China decides to actually go ahead and have a quick war with Japan in relation to the Daisuke Islands that it has kind of I'm sorry, it has kind of, sorry, Senkaku Islands. I'm sorry about it. It has an issue with Japan about, right? So you have a nation which has been weakened uh, in an economic sense due to its fiscal policy, and due to the fact that it doesn't have a lot of new population coming in. So it has to take certain steps, and then you have an additional burden of the war itself. Third thing is that this is kind of very interesting. Before the lost decades, during somewhere around the end of close to 1987, 1988, which was the peak of the Nikkei index itself, it was said that the real estate market in Japan, the real estate of Tokyo, was worth more than the real estate of entire, sorry, California. Or they said that the real estate value of the palace of the royal family of Japan was worth more than the entire real estate of Manhattan. This was the point of time when Japan, in the golden decade, everything was going right. So there was a lot of money coming into the in the Japanese economy itself, and at that point of time, it created a huge bubble. And this huge bubble at that point of time, uh, fortunately or unfortunately, had a lot of very low interest rate. So basically, Japanese banks were printing a lot of money at very low interest rate, and they were giving it to companies, or they were giving it to large corporates like Sony's and other families, powerful families, and those families themselves were as well pumping in that same money in the real estate sector, right? And then the foreign money was as well coming in the real estate sector. So then the crash that Japan saw a couple of decades back in the real estate itself, what happened is that it has not recovered. So people bought their houses, let's say, in the year 1989, 1907, 1988, 1992, so on and so forth. And then the value every year of the real estate market dropped. So people were locked into a 20-year loan, a 30-year loan, not knowing, or sometimes even knowing, that the value of the house they're buying is actually going to reduce year on year. So let's say you buy an asset of How would you feel in this deflationary economy that you bought a house at $1 million and you're paying interest for $1 million, but next year the value of the house is 900,000, but then you're locked at 1 million. The year after that it's at 800, then 700, then 600. So technically you're servicing a debt which is of a much higher value than of an asset which is not even of that value itself, and that has become the problem, a very long term problem for Japan itself. The reason after this that I see, and this is going to be a big problem for Japan, is that Japanese culture per se has kind of the uh, the culture of Japan, which is very much the shogun based culture, or the hierarchical culture which was there, since since the history itself, where the hierarchy was respected a lot. So even in Japanese companies, what happens is that people don't switch a lot. They join a company, they work their way to the top, and they remain in that company throughout their working life itself. Probably they'll probably switch once or twice, right? Not more than that. And then what happens is that because of this, the corporate wages in Japan are actually are quite depressed in relation to what they do. So there's not a lot of innovation. People kind of are not given a lot of freedom to innovate a lot in the way they want. And second of all, because they don't switch, they don't try per se, the salaries of Japanese employees on real term wages are actually lesser than similarly high technology based employees in other countries itself. So first of all, you're anyways not being able to service the tax burden. Then you have a corporate culture which makes sure that you're not able to innovate, and you're working in a certain process, a certain system itself. Then after that, I'll say right now what's happening is that Japan is basically using Jetro, Jampro, and all these banking sectors to basically give loans which are much lower than, let's say, the interest rate of ADB, World Bank, and so on and so forth, to developing countries which they think can act as a hedge against, for example, China. So for example, Japan is right now pouring in billions of dollars in the bullet train project for India, wherein the interest rate is actually extremely low. It's actually very good for India, but it may not be the best deal for Japan. Now, the thing is that why Japan wants to invest in India is to make sure that it works as a hedge in China. Now, similarly, what happened is that Japan started to pump in a lot of money like this in South Korea to make sure that South Korea becomes very strong compared to North Korea and China itself. But what happened is that money eventually went into infrastructure, and through infrastructure, it kind of made life of Korean chaebols easier. So Hyundai was able to take that money into HCC, which is Hyundai Construction Company. And since HCC was doing very well in infrastructure, it started to as well make very good cars itself. So in a way, Japanese money, trade money, somehow ends up making its own competitors for its own products. So that itself is kind of a hindrance. And then Japan, because of the fact that the Japanese bond market is now under immense pressure, has actually reduced a lot. So basically, what's happened is at one point of time, the foreign institutional investor in Japan had close to 75% odd holdings. But right now, foreign institutional investors, the external money in Japan is actually less than 6%. So slowly and surely, somehow, because of the stagnancy, very long-term stagnant period itself, Japan has not been able to become a very investment friendly or attract a lot of investments in the country. Last but not the least, I would like to say is the biggest problem with Japan is the revolving door policy for prime ministers. So Japan practically changes a prime minister every year. So in the last 11 odd years, they've had 10 prime ministers. As in, the man who served the longest was Shinzo Abe, very respected in India. He had a very good relation with Mr. Narendra Modi, a visionary man who actually wanted to get, till a huge extent, he wanted to actually get Japan out of American influence, and he wanted to actually make sure that Japan has its own influence on other countries like India, Philippines, Vietnam, so on and so forth. And they call it Abenomics. So Abenomics was very different. He wanted to basically kind of change the way Japanese people look at economics itself. Um, Unfortunately, he's died, but even Abenomics couldn't save Japan from what's actually coming. And what is probably going to happen in the next coming decade itself is that because of immense amount of pressure, in relation to the spending that Japan has to do in relation to healthcare, servicing the elderly, and at the same point of time, I believe that Japan will now start building a blue water navy and has to probably go ahead and militarize itself a lot, which is actually very expensive, considering the fact that how China is kind of acting very aggressive and belligerent. So this decade will be a very difficult decade for Japan. So those are my points in relation to Japan itself, and you can probably take a look at video. Do subscribe. Do actually add your comments. Tell me as to why do you think what would happen to Japan, or why do you think that probably Japan has the chance of bouncing back just like the way it was there in the 80s. So see ya, goodbye, and you have a good one. Cheers, bye.